Howdy. One way to make sure that at least every half hour everyone's still awake after going through lunch and a break and everything else, we'll get the howdy from most of you anyway. Appreciate the opportunity to speak this afternoon, talking about specific categories of road users. We talked about what are probably mostly passengers in our previous presentation. Now we're going to talk about older drivers in particular. Older road users can incorporate pedestrians, can incorporate cyclists and others, but focusing on the design of the roadway and how that affects drivers in particular. The context of this presentation is going to have a lot to do with the recently released Handbook on Designing Roadways for the Aging Population from FHWA. So in that context, real briefly, wanted to make a few acknowledgments. We at TTI were privileged to lead the release of this document in 2014, but there were a number of other people who worked on previous drafts of that and prepared a lot of the material for FHWA, as well as a cast of many within FHWA that had either review or contributions or other things. It's a very comprehensive document. There's a lot more to it that we're going to be able to cover this afternoon, but I do want to make sure that gets across, and so we'll provide some opportunity for you to locate your own copy of that document. Here's a link. We will show that again later at the end of the presentation, but just to show you where that is and where you can find it so that you can use that if you don't already have your own copy downloaded. As Patrick alluded to in the introduction, we're increasingly seeing more and more drivers that, and road users in general, that are crossing some of the thresholds we commonly refer to as older or as aging or as senior citizens. And not only is that number increasing, but the percentages are also increasing. We see some of the most recent statistics by the Administration on Aging shows that about 39.5 million people in the United States were over age 65 as of 2009. And then about every decade after that, they estimate an increase of another 15 million people. So about 55 million people by 2020, about 72.5 million people by 2030, and the number goes on. So we see a steadily increasing proportion of people using our roads, and in particular for this session, drivers, who will be more and more maybe the design driver going forward as someone that's over age 65, especially in certain parts of the country where we find more people moving to retire or just as people age in general. And how do we accommodate those people's needs? Those people will increasingly have declining abilities to see and hear surrounding traffic, the declining ability to walk from place to place or to physically do what's necessary to operate a vehicle, as well as have increasing impairments or delays cognitively in being able to process information and make the decisions as they go from place to place. And so those are the types of things that increasingly lead the powers that be to develop resources to address those questions. As we shift from the nation down to the state, the recently released Strategic Highway Safety Plan provides some interesting statistics within the state of Texas. And for this particular chart showing years 2010 to 2016, so that 7-year period, there were just short of 3,000 fatal crashes involving people who are 65 and older, and almost 11,000 crashes involving serious injury. And of course, the average then is usually involving more than one person per crash, so you can extrapolate from there, about 3,400 actual fatalities and almost 14,000 injuries, serious injuries, incapacitating injuries over that period of time. And those numbers are increasing. All of those trend lines in general are going up, as well as a lot of the subsets within them are also increasing over time. Also, according to the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, the number of males 75 plus and females 80 or older are overrepresented in crashes based on the number of miles that they drive. So Again, not just the numbers of crashes going up, but also the proportion of crashes that you might expect for their participation. So we see a steady increase in crash rates for that category of drivers. And what we also learn is that older drivers are much more likely than their younger counterparts to be involved in crashes at right angles and same direction and opposite direction, less likely to be involved in a crash by themselves. So it's when they're around other traffic, typically in urban areas and the developing areas, maybe just around their neighborhood, but in interacting with other people is where we often see those crashes occur. Well, the SHSP lists 5 different strategies that recommends for improving safety for older road users. And again, road users, not just drivers, but also pedestrians and cyclists. Those 5 are listed here, and collectively those 5 strategies also have associated with them 21 different countermeasures and programs to support their implementation. What we want to talk about here is that second one, design and operate roadways to meet the needs of older road users. And one of the ways to accomplish that is through the use of the FHWA Handbook. There's a total of 5 countermeasures that are listed, and we will also provide the link to the SHSP if you haven't seen it. But what we want to focus on is the use of the handbook in not only getting ideas for countermeasures that can be used, but then how to implement them and how to consider where they might be most useful. So the handbook, if you're not familiar with it, is the 3rd edition in this FHWA series. Began back in the late 90s. We were revised again in 2001. But over that next roughly decade and a half, a lot of research has been completed, a lot of technologies have improved. We've learned lots of new things about human factors and what we're able to see and do. And so it was time to update that document. And included in those updates was a change in the title. It used to be for designing for drivers. Now it's designing for the aging population to, again, acknowledge that there are people in that age category that walk and that cycle and that do other things besides get behind the wheel of a car. But it still, at its heart, is a design-based manual for drivers, and much of the treatments that are in there cover that aspect. But it does include, again, that newer research that was done, now you're not disadvantaged by going online to get it rather than just kind of seeing a snapshot of the printed version, which is what was there before. There's now a truly interactive HTML version that's on the website. If you are familiar with previous editions, the layout is fairly similar. The front matter in Chapter 1 talks about what's in the document. There are some worksheets that provide ways for the practitioner to actually fill out details about a site under consideration and maybe to weigh different countermeasures and the pros and cons and how to use the manual in general. The 5 chapters in Part 1 are each about a category of treatments and recommendations for their use. And then Part 2 is the companion to that. It talks about the rationale behind those treatments, the research and the supporting evidence that goes behind the recommendations that are contained therein. And then there's some appendices at the end to kind of round it out. And again, a similar focus on 5 categories of treatments that have been in the manuals in the past. The categories are shown here on this table. In today's session, we're going to talk mainly about intersections because that's where a lot of the design-related treatments are located, is within intersections. But you can also see the categories include interchanges, include roadway segments, typically rural, includes work zone treatments, and then there are a couple of treatments on highway rail grade crossings. Total of 33 what are called proven practices. These are treatments that over the course of the years and the decades have had a fair amount of supporting research that's been done to not only determine whether a treatment is effective and in what conditions it would be, but maybe even to help quantify some of those benefits that a user could see. That middle category is what's called promising practices. These are things that at the time the manual was published were kind of on the cusp. These are things that we think have potential, and so far things look good, but maybe they just haven't had the thorough research to support and to provide that documentation about specific findings and benefits that a practitioner might see. But they're included for reference, and as the research develops, then that can be added to the body of knowledge as well. So there's a total of 51 treatments. We're not going to go through all 51 of those. In fact, we're not going to go through all 24 in the intersections, but we're going to go through a section of them to give you an idea of what's there, and maybe to help us think about if I have a location where I expect to see a high proportion of older drivers, what are some things that I can do to help mitigate the potential for crashes and to otherwise help the operation of the roadway. So as we look at intersections, one of the things we want to look at is intersection sight distance. We've already talked about if you have a car that doesn't have a driver, what kind of intersection sight distance does it need? It may be less. Well, in the time being, if you have a location that has a high proportion of older drivers, they may need more. And so if you have such a location, the recommendation is to provide a gap value of at least 8 seconds in your ISD calculations, and in increasing that incrementally if you have additional lanes to be crossed. Also recommends the use of offset turn lanes with a positive offset of at least 4 feet if the predominant mode is passenger cars. If the opposing vehicle tends to be trucks, add another 1.5 feet to that. And that's the recommended offset if you can provide that level of separation on your intersections. Now, if you can't provide that level, there are some minimum values that are given, and the table is provided based on the design speed and whether, again, the vehicle you're considering is a passenger car or whether it's a truck. But minimum distances are recommended depending on the available space that you have within your right-of-way at that location. And of course, then there's a plethora of different signs and markings that can be added to supplement that design. The caveat there is, as we know, as experienced designers, we shouldn't rely on the signs and markings to make up for things that we probably should have included in the design. They're there to supplement it, not hopefully to overcome something that we didn't include the first time around. But you can see many examples of things that you can use to help enable that design to be better understood by those that are traveling through it with the signs and the markings. Channelization is one thing that's mentioned predominantly or frequently throughout the chapter. For locations that are less than 45 miles an hour, and we heard earlier today about having a section of 65-mile-an-hour road with a curb, not a good idea unless you've still got your shoulder there. But for lower speed roadways, the recommendation is to provide that raised channelization, but with sloping curbs, with the idea that even when you're providing that, if your older driver may not have a good sense of where their vehicle is in relation to where the curb is, if they strike it, they're not striking a hard vertical surface, but there's still some give in that sloping curb face. Also recommended to provide retroreflective markings for those faces, to provide that contrast, to help provide visibility for where those channelizing islands are located. Recommended that for right turn treatments at speeds of 45 or higher, that an acceleration lane is provided downstream of that lane to provide additional room for the driver to get up to speed. Whether it's left turn or right turn channelization, it's also recommended to provide raised pedestrian refuge islands. So whether it's a median island next to your left turn or whether it's what's traditionally been called the pork chop island or the triangular island next to your right turn. And there's existing guidance for that in both the METCD and in AASHTO. And as you know, if you've ever tried to cross a street with a two-way left turn lane on foot, a raised median is preferred, and we saw examples of that again earlier about having the proper cutout within that median, either to provide the ramp and the landing and back down, or the level landing all the way through your median island for those that need the extra mobility assistance. The picture here shows an example of what some of those markings on an island might look like, with, in this case, painted on, but there's a number of different retroreflective treatments that can also be used. And the handbook provides a way to calculate what the minimum in-service contrast level would be. This is used on a number of different marking treatments, not just this delineation, but it does provide the example. And it does make a distinction whether whether that section of roadway has lighting or not. But again, the idea is to delineate the curbs to help provide an extra set of visibility for the approaching driver to avoid striking those curbs and channelizing islands. If your design provides left turn lane, the preference is to provide protected only in your left turn. That's not always possible, so it does have the caveat of wherever appropriate, and it leaves a lot of latitude for you to determine where that's appropriate. But protected only is preferred, particularly where the minimum intersection sight distance requirements, whether they're achieved through offset left turn lanes or other methods, may not be quite where you want them to be. When you do provide permitted left turns, and you do provide the permissive green ball, the recommendation is to use the R1012 sign, and they even recommend, if you have the ability to do so, to provide it in advance with that signal to let that older driver know, particularly if they're unfamiliar with the location and they're having a hard time processing everything they're seeing. Give them some advance notice that it's coming. And if you do that, it's also preferred to have lead left turn phasing over your lag left turn phasing. Also within your design, again, if you're talking about providing left turn lanes or just intersections in general, providing that information ahead of time if you can. And the last revision of the MUTCD contained more specific mandates, if you will, requirements on the minimum letter heights for ground-mounted signs. That table's provided at the bottom based on the posted speed limit. It also recommends the use of overhead sign supplements at intersections, which are commonly used across the state at signalized intersections. It also recommends, where applicable and where appropriate, the use of advanced street name plaques. So you can see where in your design, even if you've got the number of lanes and the shoulders or the curb and all the things that you would normally include in your design, there's still potentially a lot of room within your right-of-way that you might need for your signage or the other things that go along with these recommendations if you're in an area where you might see a large number of older drivers. Stop and yield signs, same way. It's recommended to use larger ones if you can. The required sign sizes by MUTCD are listed here. Repeatedly recommending use of minimum retroreflectivity levels on your signs so that visibility is maintained. A number of recommendations on supplemental signs, such as this yellow one for two-way stop to make sure the drivers know that cross traffic will continue to go. More advanced signage, stop ahead sign placement, etc. And a consideration of whether transverse markings and other supplemental pavement markings might be needed on the approach to your intersection. Depending on your lane orientation and how many lanes you have for each movement, excuse me, it might also be a good idea to provide supplemental signs on your lane assignment. Whether it's a turn-only lane, whether it's a through-only lane, particularly if you have a shared lane, providing additional signage, and it's recommended to go on the mast arm next to your traffic signal heads, to have that as a supplemental source of information for your driver. The thing to consider as a designer is, am I providing the lane combination that's going to best suit the anticipated traffic movements that I'm going to have for the foreseeable future, so that you can provide the signs accordingly. One of the things that's listed as a promising practice, it's been considered in a number of different ways, but it hasn't been fully developed in the research as other topics have, is the design of that right turn channelization island. The one on the left is something that you might typically see in a traditional design. And of course, this graphic is simplified, but the angles that are shown are kind of representative of what you would see. And for a couple of reasons, there are some potential issues with this. One is the driver in the yellow car, if that's an older driver, is going to have a difficult time turning their head 142 degrees back to the left to see who's coming at the position that they're located. Again, mobility changes, it's reduced, as well as the ability to comprehend what they see, particularly if they're still moving. If this has, if this lane doesn't continue and they're trying to merge, but yet they're still moving, then they're processing a lot of different information at the same time. So the recommendation is to change up that angle so that the direction that the driver is looking is much closer to 90. They can better see what's coming and better make the decision. And associated with that is that will also slow down the vehicles as they're traveling through. So more along the lines of 17 to 18, this even says maybe down to 14 miles an hour, compared to something like this that could be 20, 25, something like that, or higher. Now, one of the other benefits of having that kind of a lane is it also facilitates pedestrian crossings. If the driver is traveling more slowly, it also gives them a better chance to identify pedestrians, but also the location of where the island is located and where the crosswalk is located has an effect as well. One of the things they recommend is to use a walking speed of 3 feet per second in terms of your signal timing, but also to know how far people are going to have to travel. In this case, with a right turn channelization lane, having to make that extra leg of the crossing before they cross the primary part of that approach leg. And the recommendation that there's enough room between the yield line and the crosswalk so that the waiting driver doesn't have to be queued up or idling on the crosswalk in order to make that change. And again, there's recommendations within AASHTO, Green Book, and with METCD and other sources that provides more details to that. One other promising practice, we talked about lane assignment signs on the mast arm. This also provides overhead guide signs, perhaps in advance, perhaps at the location, typically used in conjunction with freeway entrance ramps or other types of intersections like that. Where there might be a change in driving environment. But in this case, if the intersection is complex, if you have entrance ramps and exit ramps close together, if you have multiple signals, if you're, maybe it's on either side of a diamond, those types of things, providing overhead guide signs could also be worthwhile in an area where you might see a lot of older drivers and helping them to process that information. Signal head visibility, again, depending on how many lanes of which type you've provided in your design, helps to affect how many signal heads you need and where they should be placed. The recommendation is to not place a signal head that displays a circular green over or directly in front of a left turn lane. If it's circular, it's probably shared, and so it's going to be centered over that lane line. If it's for a left turn lane only, then you don't need to show that circular green indication. You can either show the flashing yellow arrow, or it could be protected only and you don't need that option. One item we talked about was with the destination signing, leading into interchanges is wrong-way driving, and it's an increasing problem that we're seeing in this state as well as others. That seems to disproportionately affect older drivers. And so there are a number of countermeasures that are in development, some design related, some traffic control device related, some overlap, that can help a location reduce the likelihood that a driver is going to misunderstand which ramp they need to take. And so there are additional treatments that are out there that are being tested, that are being documented on countering wrong-way driving. Improved lighting, better channelization, in some cases prohibiting the turn through channelization so that you can't physically go the wrong way onto an exit ramp, as well as signs and markings that go along with it. The recommendation is that this could be done in conjunction with a road safety audit, and Federal Highway Administration has a number of different tools and resources to help the practitioner make those assessments for a particular location and identify some things that might be issues that can be addressed. So the handbook, it provides an update to a long-running series. The gap between this edition and the previous one has been a while, so again, a lot has been done. This document doesn't constitute a standard. There's no requirement in there, but it does provide a lot of considerations for the practitioner to think about when either designing a new location or making revisions and updates to a location where there might be a lot of road users, in particular drivers of that age category. The handbook makes a lot of recommendations to existing documents, such as the Green Book, such as MUTCD, IT Traffic Engineering Handbook, and many others. The cross-references are provided through there, and the comparison of the recommendations, how one stacks up to another, are provided as well for easy reference so that you can see, am I meeting the minimum that those require, or am I exceeding those in some ways to provide that extra cushion for the road users that we intend to see. I will stop there. Again, the location where you can find the handbook is on the Office of Safety website for FHWA. You awake again? The SHSP link is also there at the bottom. That's just been released through TXDOT. And if we have any time remaining, we'll take questions as you've got them. Okay, says we've got a few minutes. Yes, sir. Okay, good question. Question was, does this document take into account the new innovative intersection designs that are being discussed, such as DDIs and MUTs and others that we saw in the first half? The answer is yes, in general, in the sense that the principles are here for intersection approaches of all kinds. Now, specifically, no, it doesn't have a section on DDIs or on some of those others. It actually does have a section on roundabouts. That is included individually. The others are probably taken kind of as in general for design principles and TCD practices that could be applied in a number of locations. Anyone else? Yes.
Do you have a percentage of drivers that are intoxicated when you have these wrong-way crashes?
I can refer you to someone who knows that answer a lot better than I do, Melissa Finley at TTI. But typically, a lot of drivers involved, I'll just say a lot, I don't know what that percentage is, a lot of drivers, in response to the question, a lot of drivers tend to be intoxicated that are involved in wrong-way driving. I don't know the exact proportion, but I would know who to ask if we need to find out that answer more specifically.